Imagine a frame from a lost chronicle that makes your heart skip a beat, as if you yourself were standing on a scaffold awaiting sentencing, but instead of an axe, an invisible threat hangs over your head. On this grainy, black and white film, shot by an amateur camera on August 2, 1972, in a stifling corridor of the Long Beach Arena, permeated with the smell of menthol ointment and male sweat, a moment is captured that should have been just another comedy, but turned into a horror film for one man's ego. In the center of the frame is Muhammad Ali, the greatest, a man whose reaction time was faster than a camera shutter, and who built his legend on the fact that he was impossible to hit. He is laughing. He is dancing his famous shuffle. He is teasing those around him, basking in the rays of his own glory, but suddenly the film seems to jam. The laughter breaks off mid-sentence. His mouth remains open in a silent cry, and his eyes, those famous, always confident eyes, widen to the size of saucers, filling with pure, distilled terror. You probably think he saw a gun, or that he had a heart attack. That would be a logical explanation for such a sharp change in the face of a man who feared no one in the world. But the reality hidden in this freeze frame is far more frightening, because the enemy that caused Ali to petrify was not outside, but within his own perception of the world. To understand this moment of collapse, you need to look away from the champion's face and look at the object frozen in midair, violating all boundaries of personal space. It is not a boxing glove, soft and safe. It is our narrative dagger, a bare, calloused, rock-hard heel hanging a millimeter away from Ali's perfect nose. Ask yourself honestly, how could a man who dodged 21 punches in 10 seconds in a fight against Brian London miss an attack he didn't even notice? Ali came to this karate championship like a king, looking down condescendingly at his subjects. To him, these guys in white pajamas, waving their legs and shouting strange words, were not fighters, but dancers, a funny side attraction. He approached Chuck Norris, then young, but already a deadly champion, with the same casual grace he used with journalists. Ali wanted a show. He wanted to prove that boxing was the pinnacle of evolution, and everything else was just child's play. "Hey, Karate Kid!" His voice boomed through the corridor, attracting the attention of every reporter within a mile. "Your legs were made for walking, but my hands were made for killing. Try to touch my face. I'll give you a head start. I'll even drop my hands." It was a classic Ali trap. He would provoke, force the opponent to attack, and then, using his superhuman reflexes, slip away, making the opponent look like a fool. He took his signature stance, relaxed, hands dangling at his sides, chin held high. He was certain he controlled every atom in that space. His brain, trained by years of fighting, scanned Chuck's body for familiar telegraphs. A shoulder twitch means a jab is coming. A hip turn means a hook. Ali was waiting for a hand attack. He was waiting for boxing. But here, the Santa Barbara effect kicked in, shattering the psyche. Chuck Norris had no intention of playing by Ali's rules. He didn't twitch a shoulder. He didn't clench a fist. He simply disappeared from the champion's field of vision, using a trajectory that does not exist in the world of boxing. In that fraction of a second, when Ali was waiting for a familiar movement, Chuck Norris did the impossible. Without a wind-up, without warning, his leg shot out in a complex arc from the bottom up, utilizing the blind spot of peripheral vision. It was a Mawashi Gary, a roundhouse kick, but executed with such speed and stealth that Ali's brain simply didn't have time to process the danger signal. In a boxer's world, a threat always comes from shoulder level, but this threat came from floor level, and it moved faster than thought. Ali stood there smiling, preparing to slip, but there was nothing to slip from because he saw nothing. And suddenly, a whistle, the sound of air being sliced right by his ear, and then silence. That very calloused heel, rough, hard, capable of crushing a skull, was frozen in the air, touching the hairs in the nose of the greatest. Ali didn't blink. He didn't recoil. He froze, turning into a pillar of salt because his neurons responsible for survival suddenly realized that he had been dead a second ago. It was just that his body hadn't fallen yet. He stared at that leg hanging before his eyes and realized that if Chuck hadn't stopped the strike, his face would now be caved into his skull. All his confidence, all his bravado, all his titles evaporated in that single millimeter of space between life and death. He, the king of speed, turned out to be slow. He, the king of reaction, turned out to be blind. In that moment, in a grimy corridor in Long Beach, Muhammad Ali felt for the first time in his life not like a predator, but like a victim who didn't even realize where the bullet came from, and the silent horror in his eyes was more eloquent than any words about greatness. To truly appreciate the scale of this psychological trap into which Muhammad Ali drove himself, with the grace of a dancing suicide, we need to rewind the tape 5 minutes and immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of that corridor, where the air was electrified not by an upcoming fight, but by the pure, undiluted arrogance of one man. Ali, in 1972, was not just an athlete. He was a living deity, a cultural phenomenon, who sincerely believed that the laws of physics and biology made an exception for him. He looked at Chuck Norris, standing in his snow-white kimono, and saw not a dangerous opponent, but a funny comic book character, a guy in pajamas, waving his legs for the public's amusement. To Ali, raised in the brutal, pragmatic world of professional boxing, where every blow is aimed at destruction, Eastern martial arts seemed like choreography, a beautiful but useless ballet that would crumble to dust at the first encounter with the reality of a heavyweight. He began to circle Chuck, performing his famous shuffle, his feet moving with such speed it seemed as if he were hovering an inch above the floor, mocking gravity just as he mocked his opponents. "Hey, Hollywood!" Ali shouted, his voice, accustomed to drowning out stadium noise, echoing off the concrete walls, causing journalists and onlookers to huddle in a ring, anticipating a free show. "You think your toy strikes can reach me? I fought Liston. I fought Frazier. They tried to take my head off, but they hit air because I'm a ghost." He threw fast, stinging jabs that stopped inches from Norris's face, demonstrating his total superiority in hand speed. Ali was savoring the moment. He felt like a puppeteer pulling strings, making the world revolve around his ego. He expected Chuck to be afraid, to back away, to start waving his arms in a panic, trying to defend against this barrage of punches. But here, the conveyor belt principle kicks in, making you doubt the sanity of what's happening. Chuck Norris didn't move. He stood absolutely still. His hands were down, and his breathing remained steady, like that of a sleeping child. And this stillness, this strange, unnatural stasis, began to irritate Ali. Do you think Ali perceived this calmness as a threat? You're wrong. His brain, poisoned by years of triumphs, interpreted it as the paralysis of fear. He's frozen, Ali thought. He doesn't know what to do. He sees my speed, and it hypnotizes him like headlights hypnotize a deer on the road. And then the greatest decided to raise the stakes, making a mistake that is studied in martial arts academies as an example of fatal overconfidence. He stopped. He ceased dancing. He stood directly in front of Chuck, within striking distance, and did something that would have made his trainer Angelo Dundee go gray in a second if he had been there. He dropped his hands. Completely. He opened his jaw, his torso, his life, turning himself into the perfect target. Ask yourself honestly, what makes a man whose face is worth millions of dollars take such a risk? It was the rush of a gambler, certain the deck is stacked in his favor. Ali said, come on, Karate Kid. Try to touch my face. I'll give you a head start. I won't even raise my hands. I'll see your strike before you even think of it." At that moment, the Santa Barbara effect flipped reality upside down. Ali was certain he controlled the situation because he was looking at Chuck's shoulders. In boxing, a punch starts from the shoulder, from the turn of the torso, from the tension of the back muscles. Ali was scanning Norris's upper body. His radar was tuned to find boxing signals. He was ready to slip a jab, a hook, a cross. But he forgot one small, deadly detail. He wasn't in a ring. He was in a world where a threat can come not from above, but from below, from the blind spot that boxers are used to ignoring. Chuck Norris looked into Ali's eyes and saw not a rival, but a man who had voluntarily blindfolded himself and stood on the edge of an abyss, certain he knew how to fly. Ali was waiting for hand movements. He was waiting for a familiar threat, but Chuck had no intention of using his hands. While Ali, basking in his greatness, smiled for the cameras, Chuck Norris imperceptibly shifted his body weight to his support leg, loading his hip with kinetic energy, much like an archer draws a bowstring. It was an internal movement, invisible to the eye, but felt at the level of instincts. Instincts that, for Ali that day, were in a deep sleep. The greatest thought he was the hunter playing with a mouse, but he didn't notice the mouse had turned into a cobra that had already coiled for a strike, and that the distance he considered safe was actually a distance of guaranteed defeat, because a leg flies further and faster than a hand, especially if you aren't looking down. In that very microsecond when Chuck Norris's hips began to rotate, triggering a strike mechanism that should have been impossible, from the standpoint of classical boxing, Muhammad Ali's brain, that perfect biological computer calculating trajectories, made a fatal error. It continued to look for a threat where there was none. Ali stared at Chuck's shoulders, expecting them to twitch and give away the intent to punch, but the shoulders remained as motionless as cliffs. In his mind, tuned to the rhythm of the ring, the absence of movement in the upper body meant safety, and he allowed himself the luxury of blinking, certain he had an eternity to spare. But it was in that dark interval of a blink, in that tiny gap in time, that reality in the Long Beach corridor split in two. The threat came not from the front, not from eye level, but from the dead zone, that blind spot below that boxers ignore, because in their world, legs exist only for movement, not for killing. Chuck Norris didn't strike. He fired himself. His right leg, tracing a wide but invisible arc to Ali, soared into the air with a sickening whistle of sliced atmosphere. And this trajectory was so alien to Ali's perception that his reflexes, which had saved him from the fists of Liston and Frazier, simply didn't fire. Ask yourself, what does a man who is used to seeing everything feel when he suddenly realizes he is blind? Ali felt not pain, but a sharp, dense gust of wind hitting his right cheek, as if a high-speed train had roared past. His ears caught the dry snap of the kimono fabric, but his eyes were still staring into the void, trying to find a fist that wasn't there. And here comes the moment of absolute, vacuum-like visual silence, when time freezes, turning into thick resin. Ali opened his eyes after blinking, and found that the world before him had changed. Instead of Chuck Norris's face, which had been at a safe distance, his field of vision was completely blocked by an alien object that had appeared out of nowhere. It was our narrative dagger, a bare, rough heel covered in hard calluses, frozen in midair, violating all laws of personal space. It wasn't hanging somewhere nearby. It was hanging exactly 1 millimeter from the tip of his nose, and Ali could see every tiny crack in the skin of the foot, every pattern on this living sledgehammer that could have turned his face into a bloody mess if it had continued its movement by even an inch. At that moment, the most brutal Santa Barbara effect flipped the greatest consciousness. He realized he hadn't slipped. He hadn't floated. He stood like a post driven into the ground, like a mannequin, and his life had just been gifted back to him by a man he considered a funny guy in pajamas. Ali tried to take a breath, but his diaphragm was gripped by a spasm of terror. He realized that if Chuck hadn't stopped his leg, the strike would have hit his temple or jaw with a force equivalent to a baseball bat, and no granite chin would have saved him from a fractured skull base. In this static scene, there was more violence than in any knockout. Ali stood there, unable to move, hypnotized by the sight of that heel, and his brain was feverishly trying to rewrite the history of the last 2 seconds. but it couldn't find the file where the defense against such an attack was recorded. He had always believed he saw the future, that he predicted his opponent's moves, but Chuck Norris had shown him that there was a crack in his crystal ball. Ali looked at that leg and felt naked, helpless, and old. All his bravado, all his jokes about the Karate Kid evaporated, leaving only the cold, sticky sweat that broke out on his forehead. He was a king who had just been dethroned without even a touch to his crown, and this non-contact blow destroyed his ego more effectively than any physical beating. In Ali's eyes, dilated to the limit, a single question was written, addressed to himself. How could I have missed this? And there was no answer, only Chuck Norris's heel hanging in the air like a sword of Damocles that had already descended, but for some inscrutable reason decided not to cut off the head. A second passed, then another, and those moments in the stifling Long Beach corridor stretched into an agonizing eternity during which Muhammad Ali didn't just stand still. He was going through an accelerated course in re-evaluating his entire life, career, and philosophy of combat. You probably expect him to jump back now, let out his signature booming laugh, and turn everything into a joke to save face before the journalists. That would be typical for Ali the showman, for the character he played in public. But the man standing before Chuck Norris now was real, stripped of masks and defense mechanisms. He looked at that calloused heel, our narrative dagger, and saw in it not his opponent's leg, but the physical embodiment of his mortality. His brain, freed from the paralysis of the initial shock, began to feverishly rewind the situation, trying to find an excuse, trying to find the moment he erred, but the answer was frighteningly simple, and therefore even more devastating. He didn't err, he was simply blind. Ali realized that his boxing radar, which he considered a perfect instrument, was tuned to only one frequency, and that there are threats in the world that his early warning system is simply incapable of detecting. And here, at this point of absolute vulnerability, an action occurs that triggers an intellectual orgasm in the viewer from the depth of the moment. Ali slowly, with the caution of a sapper working with an unexploded bomb, raised his right hand. He didn't clench it into a fist. He didn't try to strike Chuck back while he was standing on one leg. His palm was open, fingers slightly trembling, not from disease, but from the residual adrenaline still boiling in his blood. He touched Chuck Norris's ankle. The touch was soft, almost intimate, devoid of any aggression. Ali carefully, with 2 fingers, pushed the leg away from his face, as if moving the muzzle of a loaded gun that someone had jokingly pressed to his temple. There was so much respect and so much hidden terror in this gesture that those watching the scene felt a chill run down their spines. Ali didn't just move the leg. He acknowledged that the leg had a right to be there, and that his life at that moment depended solely on the mercy of the man in the kimono. When Chuck slowly lowered his leg to the floor, returning to his starting position, Ali didn't immediately break eye contact. He looked at Norris, and in his eyes, which usually radiated mockery and superiority, there was now a seriousness bordering on grimness. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the air he had lacked for the last 10 seconds, and finally broke the silence. But what he said was not a joke, nor a poem, nor another boastful statement. He leaned toward Chuck and whispered a phrase that became the final chord of this psychological thriller, a phrase that turned everything upside down. Never. You hear me? Never do that again without gloves. You're too dangerous for this sport. Do you understand what he said? The greatest boxer in history, the man who called himself the king of the world, had just admitted that there is a weapon against which he is powerless. He didn't say, "You didn't hit me." He said, "You could have killed me." It was an admission of defeat in a fight that hadn't even begun. Ali realized that his floating butterfly only worked in the 2-dimensional space of a boxing ring where kicking is prohibited, but here, in the real world, where trajectories are not limited by the Marquis of Queensberry rules, he was vulnerable. He looked at his hands, insured for millions, and for the first time saw in them not an absolute weapon, but a limited tool. This realization hit him harder than any physical contact. He suddenly felt not like a giant among pygmies, but like a man who had accidentally wandered into the territory of predators of a different species. In the look he cast at Chuck, fear and admiration were mixed. He realized that Norris wasn't just a karateka. He was the bearer of knowledge that was inaccessible to Ali. And at that moment, wiping non-existent sweat from his brow, Ali took a step back, increasing the distance, because his instinct for self-preservation, finally waking up from a lethargic sleep, was screaming at him that being near this man within kicking distance was madness. The crowd around began to come to life. Nervous chuckles were heard. Someone tried to turn the situation into a joke, but Ali wasn't laughing. He knew the truth. He knew that he had just looked into the eyes of his death, and death was wearing a white kimono and had a calloused heel that moved faster than his legendary reaction. When the blinding storm of camera flashes finally broke the thick, tense silence of the Long Beach Arena corridor, capturing for history the moment the two legends shook hands, Muhammad Ali put back on his usual showman's mask. He smiled. He posed. He even jokingly threatened Chuck with a fist for the shot, and the world, seeing these pictures in the morning papers, breathed a sigh of relief, deciding it was just another fun meeting between two celebrities. You probably think that as soon as the cameras were turned off, Ali forgot about the incident, brushed it off like dust, and moved on to his great victories and tragedies. That would be a convenient version for fans who want to see their idol as invincible, but the truth is that day left a scar on Ali's psyche that never healed. At the moment he gripped Chuck Norris's hand, he felt not the warmth of a friendly handshake, but the cold, sobering touch of a reality that whispered in his ear that his crown was hanging by a thread. Ali realized that his boxing greatness was a castle built on the sand of rules, and that if you removed the referee, the ropes, and the ban on kicking, his castle would collapse from a single precise kick of that very calloused heel that had just threatened his life. This episode became that intellectual orgasm of realization that rarely visits people at the pinnacle of fame. Ali saw the limits of his power. He realized that in a hypothetical street fight, in a dark alley where there is no gong and no gloves, his famous jabs might simply not reach an opponent, capable of attacking from a distance of 5 feet, breaking knees and ribs before the boxer even enters a clinch. This knowledge didn't make him weaker, but it made him quieter. Witnesses say that evening, Ali was unusually thoughtful. He no longer shouted about beating any man on the planet, because deep down he knew there were people who held keys to doors that were locked to him. That dagger, Chuck's leg by his nose, became an eternal reminder that even the god of boxing has a blind spot, and that spot is below the belt. But the story doesn't end with a handshake. It continues in the endless debates this incident sparked. We saw Ali acknowledge the danger. We saw Chuck exercise control. But let's set aside diplomacy and ask the question that will make your blood boil. Imagine this wasn't a stadium corridor, but a concrete lot behind a bar. Imagine Ali wasn't joking and Chuck didn't stop his leg. What would have actually happened? Boxing fans will shout that Ali, with his timing and sense of distance, would have eventually caught Chuck on a counterattack and knocked him out with one punch because hands are faster than legs. Karate fans will argue that Chuck would have broken Ali's knee with the very first low kick, turning the greatest into a stationary target to be picked apart from a safe distance. Here, the final Santa Barbara effect kicks in, making you doubt your own beliefs. We are used to considering boxing the pinnacle of combat sports because of the money and popularity, but this 1972 case showed that boxing is a specialization, not universality. Ali was the king of hands, but Chuck was the king of the whole body. And now that both have become part of history, I hand the judge's gavel to you. Whose side are you on in this eternal brutal war of styles? Do you believe that boxing, with its knockout power and head defense, is capable of closing the distance and destroying a karateka before they deliver a fatal kick? Or are you convinced that karate, and more broadly, kickboxing, MMA, has a fundamental advantage due to limb length and variety of arsenal, and that in a real fight without rules, Ali, for all his greatness, would be doomed to defeat by a man who knows how to kick? Who was Ali at that moment? A sage who recognized the danger in time and backed off? Or a lucky man who escaped disgrace only thanks to his opponent's restraint? Write one word in the comments: boxing or karate. I'll be waiting for your verdict, because in that answer lies your understanding of what a real fight is: the art of hands or the art of war with the whole body.